The Wizard of Oz is not only considered one of the most iconic movies ever made, but is also one of the go-to examples of a film that initially bombed and was quickly forgotten in its day, only to be rediscovered and hailed as a masterpiece decades down the line. But that being said, how much truth is there to that sentiment? Did The Wizard of Oz really do as bad in 1939 as the stories surrounding it would suggest? And today, I'd like to try and answer this question while staying completely objective and see if the movie was more popular than most would think. Now, please keep in mind that I am not a film historian, nor do I claim to have any formal training in this field. I'm just an ordinary guy with a love of movies and an amateur understanding of the subject. So if you're looking for somebody with more professional experience on this topic, this might not be the video for you. Okay, so to start off simply, it is true that The Wizard of Oz only technically broke even in 1939, but in actuality lost money when marketing costs are taken into account. However, what people tend to forget is that The Wizard of Oz had a massive budget for its day, costing $2.7 million to make. And though that may not sound like much, when adjusted for inflation, that comes to between $60 and $65 million as of the making of this video. And considering it grossed approximately $3 million in 1939, that would be the equivalent of about $65,700,000 today, give or take. And that's actually pretty impressive by the standards of 1939, when the Great Depression was still a problem, as well as the looming threat of World War II. And to take this a step further, considering the average movie ticket cost 23 cents in 1939, that would mean that around 13 million people actually went to see it during its original run. But please take all of this with a grain of salt, as I don't have access to the actual numbers, so these are more ballpark figures than anything else. But the point is that by the standards of 1939, the movie was actually fairly successful. The problem was that most movies of the time had an average budget of half what The Wizard of Oz did, making it all the more likely that it wouldn't make money unless it became a juggernaut like Gone with the Wind. But also keep in mind that Gone with the Wind had been hyped up for about 4 years before it was released, while the biggest thing The Wizard of Oz had going for it in terms of hype was the rising popularity of Judy Garland, as all of its innovations for the time were largely ignored by audiences before its release. But speaking of Gone with the Wind, that was another thing working against the movie, because 1939 is noted to be one of the best years in film history. Gone with the Wind, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Stagecoach, Wuthering Heights, Goodbye Mr. Chips, and so many others that I couldn't even attempt to list them all here. Even Judy Garland starred in another popular and acclaimed movie that same year, opposite Mickey Rooney, that got much more attention, Babes in Arms. So with that many great films to choose from, and with many of them either having more hype around them, or having directors, actors, or actresses riding high off of other successes, it was only a given that some would go more unnoticed, and The Wizard of Oz happened to be one of them. Though once again, considering it still attracted the attention of over 13 million people, it really didn't do that bad overall. But ironically, and contrary to what most might think, Gone with the Wind becoming the most successful film of all time didn't actually hurt The Wizard of Oz at the box office, as the latter was released in August, while the former wasn't until December of 1939 and saw its biggest numbers in 1940, giving The Wizard of Oz plenty of time to find its audience before Gone with the Wind came along. Though, like I just said, considering just how many great movies came out in 1939 that had the audience's goodwill, competition was still definitely a contributing factor to why it wasn't an immediate success. Though another, lesser known reason is probably because fantasy movies weren't actually all that popular in the 1930s, to the point that the studio changed the ending to keep it ambiguous as to whether the whole thing was a dream or not, as they didn't know if audiences would accept a place like Oz really existing. Sounds crazy, I know, but there was a time when there was uncertainty surrounding such things. But getting back to what I was saying before, the movie actually did better than it had any right to, considering everything that was stacked against it. As I already pointed out, $3 million was not a bad profit for 1939, and still attracted the attention of 13 million people. So while it definitely didn't do as good as most of its competition, and didn't really stand a chance of making back its budget, it also wasn't the total failure that it's often made out to be either. And what only further backs this up is that there's actually evidence that the movie was fairly popular in its day. In the Philadelphia story, released the next year, James Stewart is actually singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow in the scene where he's carrying Katharine Hepburn back to the house. And similarly, many noirs in the 1940s actually used the song as background melodies, though perhaps the most famous example of that would have to be the minor 1942 classic I Wake Up Screaming. Seriously, the song's melody plays throughout the entire movie, to the point that it can actually be pretty distracting considering how well known it is today. Now I know some of you are probably thinking, but Somewhere Over the Rainbow actually won Best Original Song at the Academy Awards, so of course it was going to be popular even if the movie itself wasn't. So that doesn't prove much, and that is true to an extent. There are countless examples of songs becoming extremely popular even if the movie it comes from is virtually unheard of. But it goes beyond just that one song, as in the 1943 film The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, one of the characters actually sings "We're off to see the wizard" when asked where he's going. And keep in mind that this was a British movie making that particular reference, and there's no evidence to suggest that The Wizard of Oz was any more popular in England than it was in the United States. So in actuality, it's a lot more probable that The Wizard of Oz was fairly well known and liked in its day, and among other things, a ton of other great movies being released at the same time caused it to not get as much attention. And once again, considering the numbers aren't actually that bad for the standards of the time, as well as the fact that other movies in the early 1940s were making references to it, imply that audiences did take more to it than is generally thought, and then fell into obscurity a few years later. But nothing changes the fact that it was only after being released on TV in the late 1960s did it become the beloved classic that everybody knows and loves. That is most definitely true. The only point trying to be made here is that the movie actually did better, both money and audience reception wise, than is generally thought. Because one has to admit, the evidence doesn't exactly imply the film was released and immediately forgotten. A real example of something like that would be It's a Wonderful Life, which really did flop and was completely ignored by audiences before similarly being reevaluated as a masterpiece in the 1960s. But that's a potential video for another day. Okay, I think that pretty much ends this video. So now I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that The Wizard of Oz did better and was more popular in 1939 than its reputation implies it was? Or do you believe the evidence I've given isn't enough to prove that? Whatever the case, please feel free to let me know in the comments. And let me just once again make it clear that I am by no means an expert in this field, so please forgive me if I missed anything. And also keep in mind that you don't have to agree with any of the more opinion-based parts of this video. You can feel about The Wizard of Oz and its evolving reception any way that you'd like, and I nor anybody else can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.